together. Fred, I know you'd like to come back, but the audience has...
Just one precision, which is...
Okay, precision.
No, if you allow me, just as I saw people taking notes. On the WFP figures of 80% that we hear everywhere, 80% of the food purchased, distributed in Africa is purchased in Africa. Is that 80% of the cash available to WFP is used to buy food in Africa, but in reality, half of the resources of WFP are within kind food aid. So just wanted to clarify this, as the 80% is only for the cash resources of the organization.
Okay. Let's open it up to the floor. Let's take 3 or 4 initial questions, and who'd like to begin?
George Gelber from CAFOD. I think the emphasis on small farmers and their ability to produce, and hopefully the emergence of a prosperous small, medium farm sector is very good. But the high-level task force is going to disappear, and we all know that this is a very, very long-term project which is going to require political will from donors, political will from government, and the easy solution to lack of production is to hand over several thousand hectares to a large producer and say, get on with it, which could produce cheap food for rioting urban population. And I just wondered how you see this, how we're going to redress the balance in sort of the international development system of the bias against agriculture, which is, has already been pointed out. And a second small question, I wondered whether you had any reflections about the enormous economic concentration in the international food system, the Cargills, the ADMs, what role they have played and what role they could play and what roles they shouldn't be playing.
Yeah. Okay. Gentleman over there, and then gentleman at the back. Yeah, sorry.
Hello.
Proxy microphone.
Hello. Question for David. You're saying you are.
Sorry, can you give your name and affiliation?
My name is Hans Ulrich. I'm a private consultant. You say that you consider your role as fixing some nuts and bolts at the system. The question is that enough? What is your assessment of the system? Has the system not failed the hungry people in the world? I mean, you yourself mentioned that the Millennium Development Goal on hunger isn't being fulfilled. It was formulated at least in the year 2000. That's about 10 years ago, but probably it originated about 10 years or even more ago, so that's 20 years. And here we are, and suddenly in 2008 we notice, food prices have risen, hunger is rising again. Hasn't the system failed the poor people? Aren't we failing it? What's wrong?
Gentleman there, then gentleman in front of the... Gentleman on back row, then gentleman on middle row.
My name's Stephen Biggs. It's a question for David. In your committee, it's just background, I've been involved in an international assessment of agricultural science recently.
Yeah,
and
indeed.
One of the issues there was what issues you left unaddressed, like who were the drivers of change in the world, and to be taken as just to be taken as a given, like as a previous member has just said, the concentration of ownership or power in the corporate sector or whatever, and then you work within the framework where you can't do anything about the drivers of global trade, etc. Or how much you're going to engage with the debate about actually bringing in global legislation and regulation about some of these global actors about what they can do, where, under what circumstances.
Okay. And gentlemen here, and then we'll have some reactions. We'll come to you in the next round.
My name is Steven. I do agricultural consultant.
Yeah.
I want to ask you a question. What is your committee doing about the conversion of food product to biofuel? And what are your committee thinking about the flood by the transportation of a wheat, tons of wheat, a shipload of wheat from Europe to Africa?
Yeah.
Wheat is cost more than the food.
Yeah.
So please, and about the producer, we are talking of billions of money. How will this money get direct to the producer? Maybe the media or the large producer, because in some Latin America countries now, we know many large producers of food.
Yeah.
The government take them off because they are nationalizing the land.
Yeah.
Like many companies that they produce tons of food in Latin America. So the government take the land and they said they are nationalizing. And those who they gave the land, they cannot work on the land. So they remain no food, no progress. That's my question. Thank you.
Okay, let's have some answers to some responses to those questions. Questions about the bias against agriculture and economic concentration. Has the overall system failed? Drivers of the system, which is rather similar to the one about concentration and whether we're having global legislation, and biofuels, and yeah, David.
Right. Thank you. And there's a theme to one part of the questioning, which was this the concentration of wealth and the role of large corporate groups like Cargills and ADMs, or some of the big funds that have bought up land to grow more food, and whether one works within that framework or seeks, as you suggested, global legislation to change it, or as you were saying, how you stop people being kicked off their land for the sake of industrialized agriculture. Probably this sort of group of issues is the one that causes the most intense anger and upset within the discussions and debates that we have been having. I suspect it is what drives most strongly the representatives of farmers' organizations like Via Campesina and some of the other NGO groupings like Better and More, to encourage us to collectively establish a more substantive position on industrialized agriculture and the concentration of wealth. We are not in a position to do so. We don't have the authority to do that. However, I think that there is quite a serious debate emerging among members of the high-level task force as to whether it is better to engage with these companies on global food issues, and also whether to engage with countries that are seeking through sovereign funds or other techniques to also invest massively in food production in fertile land areas, or whether to somehow seek not to engage with them at all. Because, as Josette Sheeran said yesterday morning, actually engaging with them does offer the possibility that they can be encouraged to and helped to stimulate better smallholder production, processing, value chain systems. Whereas if there's absolutely no engagement, then we, in a way, are kind of diverting the issue. I don't think that it is appropriate for me as coordinator to answer your questions direct as to which direction things will go in. I doubt we will end up with absolute clarity. I think there will continue to be variations in the position, but I agree with you, these are burning issues, and they came out in your report, they come out in the reports of the rights holders when we have discussions on the right to food, very, very actively brought out, and they came out in the conference that we had in Madrid earlier this year. So I'm not going to answer except to say this is one of the 7 or 8 really difficult issues that Simon kindly described, which make life very difficult. The next area is biofuels. Well, the good thing on that one is at least that the different parts of the system that are in our group have been working hard on biofuels, and I believe that there is a reasonably good position emerging, which, it won't surprise you, is very solidly encouraging the non-use of food crops to make biofuels, acknowledging that sugar may be appropriate, but there are some serious environmental and other consequences, and encouraging the research and other efforts to develop biofuels that can be made from non-food products. That's so obvious in a way, but the fact is there's not any kind of... There was no agreement in the FAO-led conference in June last year among member states for an international convention or any other international action on biofuels, and so it has to be done through exhortation and encouragement. How to get money direct to producers, Professor Jeffrey Sachs has been very strongly advocating for some novel funding mechanisms, because he believes, a bit like Hans Ulrich perhaps, that systems are not actually getting resources through to where they're needed, and he is encouraging the evolution of more streamlined systems for getting finance to smallholders. I think, as Terry said, this is not going down very well in some places, and we in the high-level task force would wish to see the resources get through to producers through voucher schemes for fertilizers and other inputs, and through other techniques, and we would like to see much more accountability. So that's on that one. And to Hans more generally, has the system not failed? We always have to remember that the system that we talk about, this UN system, is actually owned by the world's governments. And yes, there are things that you can always point to about inefficiencies in the system, but the policies that we take, the conclusions that we reach, the budgets that we spend, the results that we produce, the way in which we handle complex issues between nations are negotiated between governments, and we operate within that space, and sometimes that space is quite restricted. And so, for example, I would argue that FAO is an organization that has shown that it is ready to transform itself to try to become the most successful organization that it can be within the constraints provided by the member states, because it is going through the most intense root and branch reform program at the moment because of a perception that it's not doing as well as it could have been. I think more generally we have to ask ourselves what more we can do to reach hungry people, because I think Simon's point is actually very true, that the most common reason for people being hungry is that they are poor, or they are under some kind of duress because they're in a war situation, or a situation where people have power over them and are preventing them to get what is their right and entitlement, rather than because there's not enough food being grown. And in fact, the more general statement said is that there's plenty enough food in the world to feed people. The problem is not fundamentally production, the problem is distribution and access. However, we will argue that you do have to invest more in smallholder agriculture and smallholder production systems in order to ensure, A, that there is more prosperity in rural areas in many parts of the world, and B, that there is also better local production systems that benefit people. Not answering all your questions as precisely as I suspect you would have liked them, but you knew these were horrible questions. Thank you very much.
Terry, would you like to add or respond to any of the questions which we've had here?
Well, I might take a moment to sort of reflect on some of the small farmer, large farm issues, and just to say that I think we would agree with Simon and with David that it really isn't about who grows the food that actually goes in the mouths of the families' children. It's about having enough money to buy the food, and there is research that shows. Joe Swinnen, who's from Leuven University, I don't know if that's how you say it in Belgium, has done research in Senegal that shows that poor rural people who work on plantations in Senegal earn more money than smallholders working on contracts with farmers. There is proof that big farms do offer poverty reduction opportunities for poor people. I mean, that's just one example. And I'd be quite nervous about getting head up into the big farm, small farm debate. I think it's about getting money in the pockets and food in the mouth.
Simon.
I'd like to hear what you think, Steve. Actually, you've worked on this topic. What should be the international agenda? I mean, let's leave domestic national food security policies and social protection programs and the funding for those in one box, because we sort of know how to do that. The question that we really haven't managed to grapple with has been raised a couple of times. Think about the crisis, the Financial Stability Forum, the reform of the Basel Agreement for central banks, the issue about coordinated fiscal stimulus. Where's the food equivalent of that agenda? And there are some things that are, on people's minds, and some of them might make my blood freeze, really. Coordinated, publicly held global stocks. I mean,
who's in favour of that?
Well, no, but it's been mooted. He is, for a start. Yeah. Clearly, the work that another bit of ODI has done on making sure that we have genuine international agreement on not providing subsidies to inefficient biofuels. That's about international global governance, really. It's a kind of WTO type issue. I've never understood really whether the food crisis was caused by speculation, but if it was, that is a global issue, a bit like tax havens. I think there are some big grain traders clearly and some very big supermarkets. I don't know whether that's a problem at global level. I don't know whether there are excess profits, but we have lots and lots of work by the Competition Commission in the UK about our domestic supermarkets. Where is the Competition Commission for the global economy looking at how these global supply chains work? Now, who in the UN would do that is an interesting question, and is this something that should be picked up by the UN proper, by UNCTAD, by ECOSOC? And one of my extensions to the very good work you've done is to say that there is this agenda of global governance of food, which is somehow a black box we haven't opened. Your group hasn't opened it. No. Nobody has, and yet there are some big issues in there. Yeah. I'm very nervous about. I'm on the whole in favour of globalisation. I think globalisation has lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty. We stop it at our peril. But we do live in exceptional times. We need to have that conversation. We're not having it. And Steve, why don't you say why you think global food stock centrally publicly held would be a good idea?
Three very, very quick responses to that, Simon. Did the world food system break down? Well, obviously it did. But how often has the world food system broken down in our lifetimes? The answer is possibly twice, 74, 75 with the price spike then and the most recent price spike. So there are arguments that the world food system for many, many years has worked rather well, that these price spikes are sudden and sharp events. That doesn't mean, of course, that we sit back with those price spikes. So this is point number 2. Why did we run into a problem this time? In one word, lack of resilience in the system. And if you want resilience back in the system, third point, stick some physical stocks in it, or at least make sure that the physical stocks that are in the system are managed in such a way to deal with that. And that's why I believe we do need those physical stocks in there, or at least better management of them. And one of the more alarming things about this is we don't actually seem to have very much in the public realm about where those stocks are, who they're managed, and what the stocking decisions are. So, yeah.
But is that the same as saying there should be a global stocks authority holding, with a warehouse somewhere?
Not quite the same. It'd be nice to have a G20 compact amongst the stockholders that says these are the rules under which we do this, and this is what we do when we see crisis conditions. And as you've had your hand up. I mean, is it a very quick?
No, let's just kind of same line as Simon just said. I mean, one could ask, does the UN have like a risk analysis system in food, in finance, in global warming? Yeah, and I mean, this would have then maybe picked up the risk coming up in 2007 and said in 2002 we need to do something to prepare for such a situation.
So, just very quickly, as Fred said, but just to add, this was predicted because of a recognition that stocks were really running down very rapidly for deliberate reasons during the early parts of this century. And secondly, there were some very acute issues around some rather odd stock holding decisions, particularly around rice, that led to a very sharp rise in rice prices just in the first half of 2008. The Philippines in particular got very frustrated with what they considered to be rather uncooperative activities of nearby nations in not releasing some of their stocks. And so there is certainly an interest in some kind of global stock authority. This has been proposed by Joachim von Braun and colleagues at IFPRI, and Steve, of course, is familiar with this and has probably done some of the work on it. But there is no appetite at the moment for this within the context of a general lack of appetite for the kind of a global governance on food. That may be related to the concentration of wealth point that Stephen Biggs talked about, and but it may be that there are other reasons, specific governments that are just solidly against this. It would be very hard to do without there being quite a significant proportion of the G20 wanting this, and we don't get any evidence of it. One thing that's also clear is that countries have done a lot of putting grain into stock during the last few months. Lots and lots and lots of it. We don't know where it is exactly, but we are trying very hard through FAO and others to get some understanding of where current grain stocks are. They're certainly much better now than they were a year ago.
Frank, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, a very quick reflection on that. We have this ongoing discussion between models, and I think it's important that we recognize that it's not up to any group at the global level to decide what the model is, and that it's really about countries, governments with their citizens, farmer organizations, their constituencies to decide in every country what is the most appropriate production model for the country, between small and big, between cash and food. And I think it is critical to recognize that. And if we recognize that, only instead of just talking about investing in agriculture, investing in production, we need to really think about policies, about governments having policies in place. If we don't talk about that, if we don't recognize that food and agricultural policies are essential to decide on these questions, we're really missing the point, because we'll never make it at the global level. We need this convergence and support to national policies with adequate participation of all stakeholders locally and adequate support from the international organizations. Thank you.
Okay, we had another round of questions. We had a couple of people who were, lady here and gentleman on this. No, we want to catch it up.
Thank you very much. My name is Natasha Smith. I'm with AusAid, the Australian Aid Program. I wanted to thank especially Dr. Nabarro, but also all of the panel for such an interesting discussion today. I wanted to ask two quick questions, one at either end if you like. I wanted to pick up on Simon's points in his discussion points about the fact that, in a sense, the media, the politicians, they've moved on. We don't have a global food crisis now, we have a financial crisis, and that's where the attention is. And I wanted to ask David, your views on how we can actually make food part of that debate much more strongly, so that we don't become yesterday's news with this, but rather, in a sense, grab on perhaps to the coattails of what's happening on the global financial crisis to get more action on the food aspects of that. And at the other end, and picking up, I think, a bit of what Fred was just saying, I'm interested in the fact that the task force and what's happening is responding to what is needed at a country level. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how that's actually manifesting itself. Is it that members of the task force are being asked by governments for more policy advice? Is it about funding and wanting kind of project program kind of assistance? What is the demand? Because we have the system there that's supposed to doing the supplying. It's interesting to know what's the demand that they're actually responding to. Thanks.
Okay. And gentlemen.
I'm Alexander Seris from FAO, and I just happened to be here for the couple of days. And in fact, I direct the group that does the stock figures. So I can tell you something about that. Anyway, first of all, let me congratulate you, because I think you've come a long way from the first time of the crisis. I'll mention one thing about the crisis. The crisis that provoked, if you want, this kind of discussion about coordination and everything, is a crisis about lack of coordination of the member countries, as you very rightly pointed out. Since the first food crisis, if you look at the progress, yes, there has been a lot of progress, but at the same time there has been a lot of neglect, and the subject has been neglected, and then all of a sudden everybody woke up to the fact that certain things were not finished. And this is where now we're back to square one. This fund that Sachs is talking about is IFAD, basically. It started back 30 years ago. So, I mean, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. So there is a lot of the elements of the system already in place. I think one of the very productive ways in which a coordinating group like the one that David Nabarro is heading could have a real influence is by focusing on 2 or 3 issues that are actually, to me, very important. One is how to prevent crises like this. And I mean, you talked about stocks. There are many other different options one can discuss, and we have actually been doing quite a lot of thinking at FAO about these types of things, about the risk management, about the measurements. By the way, there's no way you can ever measure stocks globally, so don't pin your hopes too much on that. Stocks are the most difficult thing to measure. Actually, it's impossible to measure them accurately. So how to prevent the crisis? What system do we have? And I think it relates very much to in the financial sector, in the sense that the governments after the war tried to think about how to prevent a financial crisis. And they came up with a system, which of course is broken down recently, and now the issue is how to rebuild a new system that's more resilient. Well, the same thing on food, on the food issue. Did we have a system? Well, not quite, because all we had is globalization, liberalization, both at the national level and everywhere. Now, did that prevent the crisis? No. Now, why? Is that the culprit? Is that part of the solution, perhaps? So these are the issues that have to be asked. In rice, I was just very recently at a rice conference in Asia, and policymakers there exactly are asking the same type of question, because rice, the analysis that we did during that conference showed very clearly that had nothing to do with the fundamentals of the market. It was a policy-induced crisis. And one could say as well that a lot of the past crisis was very much policy-induced for some sectors, but perhaps not as much as the sudden rice spike. So policies are important, but then the big problem in the system, and this has to do with your coordinated system of stocks as well. If you start looking at it, why these things cannot work? Because you cannot have a contract enforcement at the international level. You see, we make an agreement. You can make a global agreement. The global agreement is as good as the people that maintain their commitment to do it. WTO is the single most important agreement on that context because the members themselves have committed to abide by the rules. And whenever one doesn't, then that shakes the whole system. There is no such thing in the global food markets, and that is what plagues all the previous commodity agreements and will plague if we don't find any other mechanism. So how we can prevent a crisis could be an extremely important part of your work. The second thing is, again, whether we prevent or not the crisis. Well, if we cannot prevent it, can we manage it? What better ways to manage the risks of such crisis, including safety nets? And I think you mentioned earlier, I think it was David Nabarro who mentioned the issue of some kind of safety nets and how this can be done. Well, there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of analysis in the World Bank, in WFP, in FAO. I mean, we all talk about safety nets, food safety nets, the right to food movement. I mean, that's a very interesting area for coordination and collaboration as to what are the best safety nets, both from the micro perspective and from the macro perspective. So I think some issues like that could produce extremely tangible and extremely useful results and get everybody from their different perspectives, and organizations, of course, have different perspectives, to contribute constructively to something like that and provide the forum through which governments can actually agree. Because the biggest problem is governments do not agree on these different things. Thank you.
Very, very good.
Thank you. Thank you. Right, we're running out of time, so although we've got a very challenging agenda put down there, could we have fairly quick replies from members of the panel? Fred, do you want to make some final comments?
On these specific ones, or
in general, or in response to the, I mean, good question about how do you keep food back up on the agenda in the middle of a financial crisis?
I think food is still pretty much on the agenda of developing countries, and especially food importing countries, which have been the most affected by the crisis. And when Simon mentioned earlier that it was a shift for policymakers, it was pretty much for policymakers in the north. That for many countries in the south, it is a critical issue today, which is still being worked out. I will have. One of the questions I had earlier, it's and relating to my remark on policies. I think it's important that we think which mechanisms or which institutions are going to work on policies. And I've heard a lot of CADAP. I'm French. When I'm in France, when I was in Dakar a couple of weeks ago, I heard a lot about ECOWAP and ECOWAS, which is a West African organization. And I don't really see who is going to do what in terms of policy making on food and agriculture between what is being done on CADAP and NEPAD, what is being done with ECOWAS and ECOWAP. And I think hope David is still listening.
I am.
I really hope that this reflection and this kind of assessment about what kind of body should be in charge. Again, on stocks, the SADC region, which is another region in Africa, has announced they will create their own regional food stocks. So it's a bit complicated because we have all these levels and layers, but it deserves attention because you can't do the same policy making if you think in terms at the continental level or at the real regional level, where you can have some kind of homogeneity in a physical homogeneity in a region and at the national level. So I will just leave it there, and thank you very much for your great sharing.
Okay. Very.
Thank you. I guess lots of things I want to say at the end, but I'll try and make it quick. I think I'd agree with what Fred said. You know, food is very much a political issue in many of the African countries that I work with, and not least around the whole issue of food stocks. Witness what's just happened in Kenya with the food grain reserve, what's going on in Malawi. And, you know, by all, you know, if you want to get food right back up the agenda, let's create a global food stock, because it certainly will. And none of us will forget the whole stories in the Daily Mail about wine lakes and butter mountains and all of that stuff, and what that means for price support and everything. So that's a huge political issue, and one that I think Jeff has got quite a lot of reservations about, and probably there are people in the Treasury having heart attacks every time they read that free paper on it. Well, actually, I know they're not having heart attacks. It's just a bit of an exaggeration, because Tim reminded me that this is going live out on the web. I need to watch out for that. But also, you know, in terms of CADAP, ECHO-WAP and ECHO-WAF, CADAP is thrilled. ECHO-WAF is a key player in CADAP, and the fact they're making really good progress with ECHO-WAP, which is the West African Agriculture Policy, is really good news, and it's a real fillip of support for CADAP, so we're really pleased about that. And just to finish off really quickly, just to say that the whole debate around food stocks and the fact that it's such a political issue is exactly why we need to agree on what the role of government is in the food system, and that will give us a much better guidance about what we should be doing with food stocks.
Thanks, Terry. Simon.
Our big problem and our big opportunity is that solving food problems in the world has very little to do with food, actually. The agenda shifts to new actors. I wrote a book with Rachel Slater, edited a book called Food Policy Old and New. You know, in the UK, key players in the food policy arena include the Competition Commission, because they deal with supermarkets, the Ministry of Health, because they deal with the quality of the diet, the Food Standards Agency, generating the Department of Health and Social, whoever does Social Security in the UK these days. I remember the 1970s, 80s, the World Food Council, all the things that followed the World Food Crisis of the 1970s. The World Food Council failed partly because it was a gathering of ministers of agriculture, and we didn't need ministers of agriculture, we needed somebody else around the table. And the thing I take away from this meeting is we need to revisit the global governance of food, deal with the kinds of questions that have been raised about what is driving the international food system, and the task we should be giving the task force is to help us concretize a proposal that will do for food what we are doing for finance.
Right, thank you, Simon. And final word, David?
Okay, certainly just picking up on something that Simon said. Solving food problems has little to do with food. I would say solving food problems has little to do with food production, perhaps, but it surely food standard agencies and others have to do with food, which is part of my general point, which is food needs to involve ministers of agriculture and other parts of government. It can't just be dealt with by ministers of agriculture. This has really come through so much from discussions in the high-level task force. Number two, if you listen to poor people, not so much to the governments of poor countries or the governments of rich countries, they will most frequently, in my experience and the experience of many of those who work with poor people, tell you that one of their major worries is about feeding themselves, feeding their families, feeding their children. It's just that quite often when setting development priorities, we don't listen to poor people. We may listen to proxies, or we may listen to others, but not poor people. So that would be my how to make food part of the debate is just listen, I think. And vulnerable people often don't have a voice, and sometimes we have to work through colleagues, some of whom are in this room, who help us. How are we responding at the country level? All three. Policy advice, though that's really kind of already there, what we're trying to do is to make it more coherent. Funding assistance, absolutely, and most people reckon that the value of the high-level task force will be judged if it does manage to increase resources for food security going through to countries. Gafford's colleague was gone, but he was asking a question of how to sustain the resources going into this area, and I think that will be particularly difficult in my experience. You need extremely good economic analysis and communications, which comes back to your point at the beginning, that I sense that the messages and the communications are particularly important. I've just realised about 5 minutes ago, Fred, which is why I was rude to you while you were talking, that it may be that I'm going to miss my plane, which is important because I've got something to do this evening. But I can't do that without saying that we totally agree about the ECOWAS issue and our work. We will engage very strongly with ECOWAS and are doing so for West Africa as well as with CADA for other parts of the continent, and I think that's extremely important. Just I'd like to pay tribute to ODI for all that it has done in all the time that I've been working in development, and in particular for what has happened under the leadership of Simon Maxwell. I'd like to pay tribute to the work of Steve Wiggins and his team, and in particular to the effort to develop a network around this issue which Sharada has been taking forward. This is really, really good, and one of the reasons why I wanted to come today was simply to say those words, that this is a very, very important organisation, and I think all of us benefit from your work. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'm going to say one word in conclusion, and that is we are now all terrified, those of us who are working on food issues. We had a nice little agenda like that, and on a meeting like that, the agenda now looks like that.
That's right.
So we've got plenty of work to do. Thank you very much to David Nabarro. Thank you very much to our discussants. Thank you for coming and participating. Great.